Good morning, students. Welcome to the lecture on xenophobia and the other in Dracula. Now, before we begin the lecture, I want all of you to have your notes on this particular topic open either on your desktop or on as prints, because we'll be referring to the notes and the important concepts that we are going to talk about in this topic. My webcam recording is not very clear. As you can see, there's a green hue which has come with the software, which I can't eliminate, but I think it is clear enough to see me, and it's clear that you can see the screen as well that I'm sharing with you. So I have the note open in front of me, and as I take you through the lecture, please refer to the note accordingly. All right, so let us talk about this topic of xenophobia and the other in Dracula. As we were talking about this in the previous class, xenophobia refers to a phobia that is an irrational fear about the foreigners. And the term other again is loaded with a lot of connotations. The idea of the other is that a community or a person who's not like us, and therefore we have a certain degree of anxiety, a certain degree of fear, a certain degree of stereotyping and misgivings against the other. How do we see these concepts being used in Dracula or being manifest in Dracula? That is what we are going to talk about in this topic. So, a lot of scholars have read Dracula as a novel that focuses on the anxiety of Englishness and the consequent fear of the other in the early 20th century or late 19th century. We have to remember here again that this novel was written in the Victorian age, not in the peak of the Victorian age, but rather when Victorian age was waning towards its end and we are moving into modern era. Right. So the fear of waning Victorian values, the dilemmas that the late Victorian age was experiencing, we had already talked about it in terms of the conflict between technology and the occult and the mystic, right? And we also see that, in the figure of the Dracula, a lot of scholars have read that the core theme of Dracula is nothing but a threat posed to English society by an outsider. And here by outsider we mean the figure of Dracula. Now, if you look at all the adjectives or all the descriptions that you can associate with Dracula, you will see that he qualifies as an outsider very, very clearly. He is not an European per se. He is a Romanian who belongs to the geographical area of Romania, of Transylvania, which is not quite Europe. He is on the border state of Europe. And because it is in the eastern part of Europe and not continental mainland Europe, it is not considered to be a core element of the European fabric, right? Moreover, due to its geographical proximity to non-Western Berberic communities of the Middle East and the Orient, the Dracula seems to be not quite a Westerner, like the rest of the people that we see in the novel. All right. Let us see how we can understand this theme. Let us see how we can understand how this theme manifests itself in terms of understanding the text as well. All right. So the first instance of this fear of the other, that the Western fear of the other, here we have to again qualify it in terms of which community is considering it to be the self and what is the other for that community. Now, one thing we need to keep in mind is that the xenophobia is not peculiar to any particular communities. Communities all over the world, including Eastern communities, non-Western communities, also have been, xenophobic throughout history. And as we were talking about this in the previous class as well, that even now in the modern day contemporary age, we have xenophobic tendencies in our own society. So we cannot say that a particular community is xenophobic and another community is not. However, when we understand xenophobia in the context of the white Western identity, we have to take into consideration a lot of other things. Firstly, Western xenophobia comes from the idea of white superiority, which was the core narrative of colonialism as well. The idea that West is light, West is civilization, West is progress, West is enlightenment, versus the non-West, which is barbaric, which is uncivilized, which is in the throes of darkness. So we have to see this idea of the superiority of the West if it is manifested in the novel, and we do find several textual evidence of how a Western man like Jonathan Harker feels about the the non-West. And what we see here is that the first instance of Jonathan Harker's encounter with the non-West comes through, or Transylvania comes through his journey. All right, and what we see here is that throughout his journey, Harker seems to be extremely uncomfortable. There is a very, very distinct sense of discomfort about the other. A place that he feels alienated from, a place that he doesn't feel quite at ease. And we see it throughout in the text, in the description of the text as well. Let us look at some of it in our description as well. So when he comes in contact with Dracula and the rest of the people in Transylvania, to him, the people of Transylvania represent the other, and as they exist in a society outside the boundaries of industrialized Western Europe, right? So you have Europe and white superiority on the one hand, and then you have these places which are not quite European. And from the very first entry of Harker's journal, we see that he is either kind of derisive and denigrating towards Transylvanians, or he's expressing his displeasure at the superstitions, or he's he feels that he is not feeling comfortable in their company. We see that in one of the first descriptions that we get in the book is about the place. And when Harker is traveling, he says that the region is one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. I'm just underlining it, highlighting it in my notes here, as you can see. One of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. All right. So he is definitely looking at. Just a minute. All right, sorry for the interruption. Let me resume my lecture again. All right, so as I was saying that Harker's description of Transylvania is colored by his perspective as a white Western individual. And we see that from the very outset of his journal entries, Harker shows that he has certain preconceived notions about the place he's traveling to. And he also thinks that this is a place that is not quite part of Europe, and therefore it's a little primitive. He says, these are the actual quotations, he says that one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. Right, and we see that the Western view that he carries colors his trip to Dracula's estate as well. And it's somewhat, his hubris, his arrogance as a Western man of science that kind of gets in his ways to see the threat and the danger that lies ahead of him in Dracula's castle. All right. One of the first instances that we see of Harker's opinion of Romanian culture comes when his train is late, and instead of taking it as a regular delay of a locomotive, this is a remark that he makes. He says, to quote again, look at the notes, I'm just highlighting that part. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What might they ought to be in China? He's making a snide remark, a derogatory remark about how things work in the East and how the Eastern people are not so quite well versed with Western punctuality and Western, science. So it's not just a regular comment about the trains being late, but there's definitely, a sort of a racist way of looking at the non-West or the East that comes out from here. So Harker is being judgmental, and his judging is not only judging its worth based on how industrialized and efficient the place is, but also he's making a kind of overwhelmingly generalized statement and stereotypical statement about the Eastern Inter East, right? So we see that very clearly, and we see the resonation of these kind of narratives and these kind of attitudes in definitely in colonial narratives, where the colonists neonists claimed that they are obviously far more superior than the people in the East. And the idea of the West as an epitome of progress, of science, of technology, of superiority, of civilization, versus the idea of the East as lacking all of these good qualities. Okay. Um, yeah, I mean, Harker and in a way Stoker is likely joking here, but then it brings out the stereotypical notions that he carries and the preconceived notions about the East that a lot of Europeans would have been carrying at that point of time. Okay. Similarly, Harker's opinion on the people of Romania does not really change much throughout the journey. If you look at the very first chapter and the journal entry that he makes, you will see that he describes the Slovaks as barbarians, and he describes them as, as barbarians who would set down at once as some old Oriental band of brigands. All right. And again, when he meets the old woman, if you remember, the old woman who prays for him and who wants him not to go to Dracula, immediately Harker dismisses her as somebody who's, the old superstitious lady from the East. And he calls her ridiculous, and he insists that there is business to be done, which is more important than what he seems to wave off as backward superstitions. All right. So it is as if, he is a businessman from the industrialized England, and he believes that, this woman is a seemingly backward Romanian who could not understand the importance of getting a business deal done. So we see this tacit and often very open kind of a superiority complex working out here, where Harker claims to be, more important, more well-learned, more wise, and, the typical man from the West, right? And Harker also, dooms himself to the machinations of Count Dracula because he was unable to see, and his inability to see Romanian people he meets on his journey as anything more than backward. And that is why he does not see the warning signs. He ignores all of them, and he is really, he doesn't pay any heed to the warnings that come his way and the people who try to warn him about what might happen to him in the castle of Count Dracula. All right. Now, if we take this idea that Harker is projecting, or this perspective that Harker is projecting, and extend it to the rest of the people that we meet throughout the novel, especially the men who belong to the crew of Light, who are all Englishmen, then for them, the figure of Dracula becomes an image of a foreign element that is invading the Victorian society and the Victorian values. Okay, let me explain this point a little bit in terms of how Dracula becomes a symbolic other and the foreigner who is out there as a threat. Okay. Dracula and the threat of vampires throughout the novel is represented as a contagion. Now, what is a contagion? Just like what we are facing now, it's quite ironical. We are also facing a contagion. That is a disease that spreads from one contaminated person to another. So Dracula is almost like COVID-19, right? And, if Dracula infects somebody, that person can go and infect another person, and that's how the chain goes on. We see that Dracula in the novel is not seen as an individual or as a person. There is an utter dehumanization of Dracula, and that dehumanization is enhanced by his ways of spreading contagion. And how does he spread the contagion? By biting. And therefore, the act of biting itself is very, very bestial, very animalistic, right? So it equals him to almost like a rabid infection, like an infected dog, a viral strain that has attacked the healthy body politic of England. All right. In this, we can see that Dracula kind of foregrounds the colonial rhetoric of the diseased non-ways, which is seen as a dangerous locale for the Western body, rendered vulnerable to dangerous contaminations. Now, this was a very standard rhetoric during the colonial times, that the non-West is not only barbaric and backward and uncivilized, but it is also a dangerous place, a disease place for the Western body to get infected. Okay, so this is something that we see in the Dracula as well. So along with the idea of Dracula being a contagion and he is out there to contaminate the white population, there is one more idea that gets out very clearly in this particular discourse, and that is the idea of reverse colonialism. So the idea of reverse colonialism is the idea that colonialism can also be reversed in the way that the migration that happened from the European countries to the non-Western countries are now in reverse, and therefore the non-West is coming back to England, or the heart of the empire, and there is a reverse colonialism, a reverse taking over of the English heart of the empire by the former colonial subjects. We see this being manifest in the discourse of the Dracula as well, and the threat that Dracula poses, that the threat of Dracula and the threat of the contamination and the threat of the diseased non-West is no longer contained in the distant foreign lands. Rather, what makes it more scary for this people, this white characters of the novel, is that this diseased character or this contagion has reached Britain, has come all the way from Transylvania into Britain, into England, and it has breached the borders of Britain, and therefore the entire British race is danger. So Britain is no longer immune. Now, this anxiety about reverse colonialism was again a very peculiar characteristic of the late Victorian era, because this is the time when several other people from the colonies had started going back to the heart of the empire, and that is London. And there was, the demographic of London also changed drastically in the beginning of the 20th century, where we see that England was not all about a white population. There were several immigrants, there were other, races and ethnicities who were coming and settling in England, and therefore the idea that, the racial purity of the white race was somehow compromised, and it created an immense anxiety among the white supremacist British people of contamination by other people coming over to their land. All right. Okay. What we also need to see here is that it is not only contamination that we are talking about, but there is a very specific kind of meaning that is associated with this contamination or this xenophobia that we are talking about here. And the threat is not only that a diseased body or a contagious body is going to affect another one, but the threat is very sexualized, in the sense that the contamination is of a kind of of affecting the bloodline or the racial purity of the people. All right. This is a similar rhetoric again, going back to the colonial rhetoric and seeing parallels of this book with several other colonial texts. We see this again as a very, very prominent rhetoric in several other colonial texts. The idea that white women particularly are in threat, and they are under this threat of being contaminated by the non-Western barbaric being, and therefore somewhere down the line the purity of the race will be compromised. This threat or fear of bloodline being contaminated is seen in a very famous Shakespearean play as well, titled as Tempest. There we have a character called okay, there are pop-ups coming up. Okay, there we have a character called Caliban, who is a native of the island where the king Prospero and his daughter Miranda lands, and there is this constant fear of Caliban contaminating Miranda and thereby spoiling the purity of the British bloodline, of the white bloodline. So this non-Western threat, the masculine threatful barbarian who is out there to contaminate the white women, the purity of the white women. In Dracula, we see the same thing playing out. Dracula's main targets are white British women. He's not going after the men. He's not going after any other victims. He's going after particularly white British women, and whose modesty is kind of compromised when they're attacked. Now, this is again a huge element of anxiety, that is, British women are contaminated, and not only is there a threat to the purity of the race, but also to the moral character of the race, because as we see that as soon as these women are contaminated, they are behaving in a manner that will be labeled as immoral according to the standards of society. So they're straying away from racial purity, and they're straying away from morality, or the standards of morality as well. Right? And therefore, with their vampirization, or once they turn into vampire, there is a complete reversal of the moral values, of the feminine values that they are supposed to uphold in society. All right. We see this very clearly in the case of the contamination of Lucy Westenra. I want you to also focus on the name of Lucy Westenra. She is an epitome, and she is a symbol of English purity. The term Lucy means light, okay, and Westenra is also a name that is taken to symbolize the West, okay. So if we put it together, light and West, so the name of Lucy Westenra kind of symbolize the light of the West, okay. And with her contamination, we see that her moral character changes completely, and she becomes the sick, declining, waning representation of the waning values of the Victorian society. So, the setting of Lucy Westenra is almost like a representation of the sun setting in the Victorian day, and that anxiety that people had in terms of, a waning, declining morality, a waning, declining social values that we get to see in Dracula very well. All right. Another character that is of again symbolic importance is Rainfield, and we see that Rainfield is an extension of Dracula, is a connection of Dracula, and his abnormality is very peculiar. He starts by capturing small animals, and he moves on to bigger animals, almost like how the British Empire had started with small portions of the land, and then it went on to capture like large swaths of land, right? So his his character can also be seen as a representation and a symbol of how British colonialism works, and how it is corrupted by, again, the presence of Dracula. What is interesting amidst all this discourse of Dracula, of the fear of the foreigner and xenophobia, is that there are other characters in the novel who are also foreigners. For example, Van Helsing and Dr. Morris. They are both foreigners to the English society. Okay, Van Helsing is a Dutch. Dr. Morris is, he is Quincy de Morris, not Dr. Morris. Quincy de Morris is an American. Okay, but they are not seen as threats, or they are not seen as diseased, or they are not seen as the evil negative figures. Rather, they are seen as positive elements. Though foreigners, they are almost like the friends of the Western of the white crew, right? They are British allies, right? So the Dutch and the Americans are both symbolic of the capitalism that runs side by side with colonialism. So somewhere, the British core society feels more at peace with the Dutch and the American than the Eastern European and the non-Western, isn't it? Whereas Jonathan in Transylvania and Dracula in London act as strangers in a strange land, these allies seem to be participating as protectors of England as as protectors of the strange land. All right. Here we want to mention a couple of scholars who have gone ahead with this reading of Dracula being seen as the other or the dangerous foreigner, and I want to mention Bolin L and Ingelbian. These are two scholars who write about this interpretation, and they say that Dracula's presence in England is a threat. All right. And in some readings, accounts vampirism recycles and updates Gothic cliches about foreign aristocrats. Now, this is not a very new idea that we get to see here. That these cliches of the foreign aristocrats were prevalent in several other Gothic texts, right? And as I told you, that his proposed invasion of England represents a fear of reverse colonialism. All right, and that was like the central threat in British society in the late Victorian, early modern age. That was emerging as a central concern about the future of imperial Britain in the closing years of Victorian's reign. It was a huge thing. It was a huge thing. The idea that now England, or particularly London, will be contaminated by the influx of the former colonized. Okay, so that can be seen in Dracula as well. Taking it as a step further, they point out, these scholars point out, that the extremes taken by the Westerners are out of their desperation to protect their Victorian values. Okay, now if you read this text to this interpretation, you will see that this idea of contamination, as I just told you earlier also, vampires' final defeat at the hands of an assorted crew of Westerners kind of exercises the fears raised by the possibility of an imperial or a genetic decline. So in order to save the purity of the race, in order to save the purity of the empire, and to stop the bloodline of the English race to be contaminated, the killing of the Dracula is very, very crucial here. All right. What is interesting here is that this is something that we have already discussed when we were talking about science versus mysticism, and whether Dracula raises critical questions about the crew of light themselves. Because we said that they are not really scientific enough. They're not following scientific protocols. They themselves are invoking superstitious tactics, and not only that, we see an utter dehumanization on the part of the crew of light as well. All right. So we can say that in this context as well, that in the process of exterminating Dracula, what we see here is that the crew of light kind of resorts to violent or superstitious tactics that seem out of keeping with the values that they should stand for. All right, and in a way they seem to be mirroring the negative elements of vampires' actions and attitudes. All right. So what it kind of boils down to is that either the evil, degenerate foreigner has managed to contaminate the crew of light more than they realize, because they are no less in terms of their violence, in terms of the methods that they adopt than the Dracula himself. Or maybe if you read it in that sense, maybe Stoker himself was raising this question, whether there is any distinction between the enlightened Westerners and the monstrous Eastern other that the novel's conflict or the epic's travel sets up. All right. Now, the idea that Dracula might have been a victim of their xenophobic tendencies, and the real evil in the novel is the violent crew of light, has been also proposed in several recent readings. It might be a little far-stretched, but we can't completely discount this reading because a lot of scholars read the anxiety of the crew of light as an anxious construction of the 19th century. All right, and they say that the complexity is quite there. We cannot just distinguish them in terms of okay, this is the good group and this is the evil entity, and therefore we have a conflict. It's much more complex than that. What we are assigning as the vanguards of purity, what we are assigning as the vanguards of positivity. How positive, how good, how morally pure are they? This is a crucial question that we need to ask. Because when we talk about the monsters in this book, we are definitely talking about Renfield, we are definitely talking about Dracula. But what about the action of the people whom we are assigning as, the defenders or the vanguards or the warriors of good? Isn't their action too quite monstrous? Isn't the violent means that they're taking and the way they're going to go ahead with it also under question? So this is a very, very crucial question that we need to understand in this topic. That the crew of light themselves ironically come off as the monster rather than the vampire they need to kill. All right, and this is the argument that Bolin and Ingelbian also make. They look at different influences and interpretations, and they go as far to suggest, to argue, I'm quoting them, they say Dracula is largely the product of the crew of light's own racist imagination. Basically what they're arguing is that there is no Dracula per se, or the whole interpretation is coming from the crew of light's point of view. I don't know, I mean, if we can stretch it to that interpretation, because at the end of the day Dracula is a gothic story. There are supernatural things that are happening, and there's no way we can discount the fantasy elements or the gothic elements of Dracula. I mean, to read this text as a realist text, where the whole thing is a construct of a particular imaginative mind, is stretching it a little too far. But we do see that Dracula induces a sort of a paranoia, and a paranoia about the tensions that were happening in the late Victorian era about the status of the empire, about the status of the white identity. And we can definitely see those anxieties being projected onto the figure of the Dracula, the idea of the other, the idea of the foreigner, the idea of contamination, the idea of of the contamination of racial purity, the idea of reverse colonization. All these can be seen manifest in the fear of Dracula that we get to see in the text. Okay, and we'll end with another scholar who goes with Bolin and Engelbian's reading of Dracula being the victim here, and the actual perpetrators are the fear-ridden, anxiety-ridden crew of light. And this is a scholar named Squan Y, and he offers Van Helsing's description of Dracula, and he says that there are hints of paranoia. So it kind of does a psychological study of the language that the light of Rue is using, and he states that there are certain hints that these people were paranoid about the Dracula, and they were imagining things and they were misconstruing things a lot. Okay, so one of the insights that he offers is that Dracula affords us is that this ideal form of imperial subjectivity, dramatized and defamiliarized in the vampire fighters, are actually in a way has to be understood through their anxiety-ridden, ceaseless and ascetic hard work, in terms of the crew of light being irredeemably vampiric in the last analysis. So what it means here is that again, the question about who is the monster here, who is the vampire here, and who is the one who's more violent. And if you give a reading in that context, you can see that it is a fear of the foreigner that drives the crew of light into such a witch hunt of Dracula. So this is just an interpretation. If you ask me personally, I do not really buy this argument completely. because as I told you, in the end of the day, this is a gothic text, and there are elements of fantasy, elements of horror, elements of the supernatural that is embedded in the text. But then again, I mean, we cannot completely discount the idea of the other, the idea of the foreigner, the xenophobia that we get to see in the Crew of Light, and the way they're dealing with their own anxieties of the society and of their own imagination. So with this, we conclude our discussion of the representation of the other or the foreign and the theme of xenophobia in Dracula. And I will get back to you with another lecture which deals with the theme of sexuality and especially female sexuality in Dracula. Thank you so much, and thanks for being with me, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.